Hello class, it's Mr. Cho here. Um, in the lesson below, you'll see a graph of what we call the racial wealth gap in the US. And it's a really important concept in looking at racial inequality in the US and the relationship between black and white experiences and et cetera, et cetera. I was trying to find a nice video to kind of summarize and explain this on the internet. I just haven't been able to find one that I like or that kind of explains the concept to the level I want. So I've decided to make my own. So what I'm going to do right now is do a dramatization, like a simulation of discussion we might have in class if we were actually in class. Okay, so I have Dr. Bonnie Henry Jr. here, my plushie, who's going to be the role of a student in the discussion. I'm going to be me. Okay, let's see how I do. Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the racial wealth gap in the US, and it's pretty big, both for average wealth, which is usually everyone in a pot, and just divide the amount of money they have by the amount of people there, and the median wealth. The median wealth is a little different than the average. It's where you take the number that's in the middle of the kind of top 50% and the bottom poorest people. So it's not quite average. That's actually a better number. But for average, the average white family in the US has about $940,000, whereas the average black family in the US has $140,000 worth of wealth. That's about wealth, and that's an important thing to say, it's wealth. In fact, the wealth gap is so big that even if a black person or a black family has a job that pays more than a white person or a white family, they still have way less wealth. So if a black person makes $150,000 a year and a white person makes $80,000 a year, the white person in general will still have more wealth than the black person. So that doesn't make sense to me. Even just math. I thought you knew how to do math. I'm okay at math. Okay. But how does that even possible? Like if someone makes more in terms of their hourly wage, how can they have less wealth? Well, I'm glad you asked, student. Well, let's look at this chart little here. So, wealth is more than just how much money you make. Okay? So, wealth includes your hourly salary, but it also includes some other things. Like, for example, if you own property, that adds to the amount of money that you're worth, but it's not your hourly salary. Also things like if you own a business or stocks and bonds, that's how people make money too. But that's not about your hourly salary. And other things like personal possessions. If you have a bunch of like iPhones, that is also a part of your wealth. Now let me ask you a question, students. If I were to get a time machine, I'd be rich if I had a time machine. If I were to get in a time machine and go back and ask you 20 years ago, okay, I'm going to give you the choice of 3 prizes, okay? I'm going to give you one prize, which is $100,000, which you're going to keep in your bank account for 20 years, and then you can take that money out of the bank account in 20 years. Or I'm going to give you a house in Vancouver that's worth $100,000. Which one would you be better off taking? Well, the housing one, right? Like housing went crazy and it's worth so much money. Exactly. So certain types of assets add to your overall wealth, which is different than your hourly wage. Your hourly wage, although it helps you, it doesn't actually make you rich in the same way that stocks and bonds and all that type of stuff. And what happened in the US is that a bunch of people were able to get a bunch of wealth beyond uh, their hourly wage. Now, let me ask you this, student. In the 1940s, maybe or so, who generally had more money, white people or black people or others? Like, well, it's white people, right? You're right. And even the poorest white people were able to access loans in the U.S., which were able to help them buy houses. Now, even if I made like $100,000 right now in Vancouver, would that be enough for me to buy a house? No, housing is really expensive. People's salaries have not kept up with the price of housing. Oh, that is true. That is very true. In fact, for many people in Vancouver, it's very hard, even if they have a good job, to buy a house if they don't get help from someone. Help from who? Well, some people have parents that have money that could help them. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Where do you think their parents got the money to help their kids buy houses? Ah, so they're inheriting that. Oftentimes because their parents were also able to have a house themselves. So let's go back to our time travel example. It's the 1940s. Why do you think black people in the States weren't able to buy houses? Well, maybe they didn't make as much money in their job. That's true. But what also happened is that people who weren't black, oftentimes white people who had traditional wealth, already had parents who had money to help them buy houses, or maybe the parents died and had money and they inherited stuff. Yeah, I'm sort of hoping I inherit my parents' Corvette. It's gonna be really nice. Well, that's dark, but let's stay on track. What what types of jobs did black people have before the 1940s? Oh, yeah, they didn't have money because of things like slavery, or maybe white people didn't have that, so they had their parents and grandparents had more historical wealth, which helped them um, gain more wealth. That's wealth, not salary, wealth as things went on. At the same time, in the States, there was all this like housing loan discrimination, where, as you know, we talked about this. Oh, we did that. Yeah. About how there's biases in terms of resumes and who gets jobs, and would you rather hire a man or a woman, a black person or a white person, etc., etc. So at the same time, black people weren't able to even get the jobs to increase their salary, but they were also disadvantaged with historical stuff in terms of inheriting. Um, this made it even worse as time went on, because we just talked about this. Okay, uh, who is more likely to uh, be in trouble with the police? Oh yeah, we talked about that Black Lives Matter stuff. Yes, we did. Yes, we did, Bunny Henry, being your student. Um, and what happens is that right now, the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. The majority of them black, oftentimes for lower level drug offenses. And what that means is that there are a lot of people who are put in jail that also can't, access good jobs. They're taken out of U.S. society in a lot of different ways, and there's studies which have found that black people are more likely to get heavier prison sentences or even get sent to jail for things that maybe on average white people wouldn't. This is also, just to do a little deep dive here. Oh yeah, deep dive, yeah. There have been some people who have suggested that the modern prison system, which was partially created by the 13th Amendment in the US, is actually an extension of slavery. Because when they abolished slavery, they said you're not allowed to have slaves or not allowed to have slave labor unless someone committed a crime against the estate. So right now, we have all these black and brown people who are in jail for crimes that maybe other people wouldn't have gone to jail for, and they're doing what we call prison labor. And a lot of the wealth of the U.S. including things like textile manufacturing, including things like all sorts of stuff, is actually built on prison labor. The prison labor of mostly Black and brown people who also um, are contributing to the wealth of non-prison people, many of whom are white, what through indentured servitude. Whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, it's a deep dive, and that's something that a lot of people don't actually think about when they talk about the wealth gap between white and Black people in the U.S. I'm gonna look over here. The other thing that's making it worse right now is sometimes how people make money in current times. What's one thing we've always told you to do, student? Oh, you told me to go to school. Yeah, school. Yeah, school will help you get a good job. Yeah, there's truth to that. But what happens right now is because school is expensive. Oh yeah, school is really expensive. Yeah, it is. Because school it is expensive. The people who get to go to school for certain things are often people whose parents can help them. Right? Oh yeah, school is expensive if your parents can't help you or if you don't get scholarships. That is true. Luckily, you're going to get a scholarship for volleyball. Yeah, yeah, I've been working out a lot. Okay, so what they've also found is that student loan debt amongst Black and brown people are much higher than for white people because white people have more savings to help their kids. They're also more likely at Ivy League schools to what we call legacies, where your parents went to school, so you get preferential treatment or a break. And that's also a thing that affects your wealth. What do you mean by that? Well, even if you're making $100,000 a year, if you have loans, that takes away from your wealth. Oh, yes, like student loans. Oh, yeah. So what that means is you could be making $200,000 a year because you went to law school, which is a good job. But if you have no housing or don't own property or a house, and you have $500,000 worth of student loan debt, you actually have negative wealth. You owe them money, even though you're making that much money. Yeah. So this is really one of the major differences in terms of the wealth, not just the salary, the wealth of people between Black and white in the U.S. And I didn't even touch on a bunch of other stuff. But this is also why it's a complicated issue, because in Canada, we have a similar gap. Really? Yeah, there's a racial gap as well, but let's think about Indigenous people. Oh, yeah, I know. Because remember, a lot of the wealth, including for people like me, I'm a Chinese Canadian citizenship. I'm a settler here, but I'm I'm not white. I'm Asian, and some of my wealth is based on taking things from Indigenous people, unfortunately, that maybe wasn't mine to take, especially in terms of real estate, but also in terms like oil and gas revenues and all that type of stuff. Stuff which was not signed away in treaties in BC. Not that treaties, as we talked about, are necessarily the best legal document if they're done under duress. Okay, let's see what we got on my list here. You got loans, yeah, loans, discrimination, got slavery, colonialism, prisons. Talked about, we didn't really talk about redlining, but you can Google that later. And the last thing I will say is this is a really complicated issue, and this also relates to what we call the gendered wage gap, which we talked about, really complicated. And it's really important not to oversimplify the gendered wage gap. We looked at that Maclean's article where they decided to charge men in general one price for the magazine and women in general one price for the magazine. I would really be careful with oversimplifying that because that doesn't take into case the nuances. In the US specifically, white women tend to make more money on average than Latino and Black men. So that's an important thing to say. There's also a racial wage gap, wage gap between Black women, Latino women, and white women as well. And, you know, if I'm hanging out with Oprah or Beyonce, because we're just friends, you know, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to pay more than Beyonce or Oprah. There's all sorts of other things going on there because of class and how much money we have or wealth. Okay, woof, I'm confused. Well, you can rewatch this video. I'll put a website in the link below if you want to do a deeper dive. But let's just know, A, the racial wage gap, the racial wealth, even I did it. The racial wealth gap is pretty huge in ways that we don't always pay attention to. Wealth is different than salary, and oftentimes we underestimate how big that head start is for some people. When people say that the US or Canada is a straight meritocracy, that's assuming we all start in the same place, but it's not. We all often start in very different places. I thank you, Mr. Chung. I thank you, student. And scene. Have a good weekend, folks.